Andy slides because he has said he wants to be on YouTube and the rest of you have not.
Yes.
Do not touch spotlight. If you do it, then you will be on the video. Boo. You can go ahead and pin things, but mostly we're going to be doing screen sharing. All right, I see that the YouTube feed has started up, so I am going to shut up and turn the floor over to Andrew Bullen from Pullman. Please tell us amazing things.
Just 1 second, I'm gonna mute everybody and then you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay, we're good. Okay.
Yep.
My name is Andrew Bullen. I am with Pullman Morris Sword. Summer kit here as well. I have been a Morris dancer since 1980, so this talk on Morris history is not so much a history lecture as remembering what it was like in the 12th century, apparently. That was my first attempt at humor. If you have questions, please type them. I would be happy to answer them. We'll come to breaks. We're going to talk about Morris history, 1136 to roughly the Napoleonic Wars, 1800, for this first segment. Then I'm going to do a little segment on how warfare has affected Morris. And then we're going to segue neatly, if I can figure out how to do that neatly, into the Abbots Bromley horn dance and the history of the Abbots Bromley horn dance. And I think away we go. All right, let's what all craziness that we got. First off, I prepared a bibliography for both this and the Abbots Bromley horn dance. They're both on the MidwestMorrisAle.org site under resources. And these are the sources that I consulted, or at least remembered in my enfeebled state in preparation for this lecture. So please feel free to get those, and away we go. Everybody's getting this, right? Okay. We are looking at a picture of England, what England looked like in roughly 1000 AD. It was divided up into huge kingdoms. The area of the Saxons, the area of the Danish, influence of Vikings mostly. But the reason I'm showing you this map, and which is, by the way, from 1936, it was an attempt to categorize the different folk traditions of England by geography, and it was a really pioneering study. But if you'll notice up in the upper right of the Danish Mercia area is where the sword dances occur. And we will see that influence of sword dancing and how it has come to be a part of continental Europe as opposed to what's outgrown from England. Nobody, despite the fact I'm giving a history lecture, I should tell you right off the bat, no one knows. No one knows the origin of the word Morris. No one knows exactly where it came from. No one knows its history. I'm going to present a couple of theories and explanations as to what scholars throughout the years have come up with, but no one really knows. Charles Mackay in the Glossary of Obscure Words in 1887 described a different definition of the word Morris, one that I tend to use, which is descended from Celtic words, mor meaning great and usal meaning noble, so a dignified or a solemn performance, basically. But more people tend to think that Morris comes from a corruption of the word Moorish. And here are a lot of definitions of and variations of the word Morris as have been applied to Morris dancing. And basically the word, if you think about it, the word becomes an adjective. It becomes a description of a whole class of dances that have meant different things throughout history. And I think the word Morris comes basically from the Moors in Spain or the Moors invading, say, continental Europe, which became the boogeymen at the 12th, 13th, 10th centuries and so forth, they became the boogeyman. So it became almost cowboys and Indians. Here's the zombies, the people that we fight against, so the opponents. So it becomes a more, not necessarily talking about Islamic forces or Moors in particular, but the other people. So where the term comes from, nobody quite knows. One theory that has been proposed, that has you may have heard of, is that the dances are remotely related to the marriage of this person. This is Queen Petronella. She's Petronella of Aragon, and she lived from 1136 to 1173. Her father abdicated the throne, her father Ramiro II abdicated the throne in 1137, which means at the age of 1 year old, Petronella was given in marriage to this gentleman and became the ruler of Aragon. And supposedly at this very important wedding, which I should tell you that Ramiro II was actually a monk at that time, and the importance of having this smooth succession in the Kingdom of Aragon to forestall the Moorish invasion and the looming Muslim hordes, as it were, the Pope actually granted him a dispensation to not be a monk for a while, come out of the monastery, marry somebody, produces Petronella. The second she's old enough legally, as of 1 year old, he abdicates the throne, goes back to the monastery, and then that's it. She, in turn, abdicated her throne at 15 and cleverly abdicated her throne at 15, got the hell out of there and abdicated for her son. This theory comes about in 1855. It's from the Historia de la Música Española by a man named Fuertes. That is the origin of this theory. And Fuertes mentions a manuscript that no one has ever been able to find since then as the basis of this theory. But nevertheless, this is the theory that is most often quoted that I have heard, that Petronella, the wedding of Petronella at the tender age of 1 year old, becomes the genesis of what became Morris dancing, a celebration therein. And it was brought supposedly back, and here's the next part of the story, by this gentleman, John of Gaunt, the third of the 5 sons of King Edward III. He was a great military general. He fought in the 100 Years' War, particularly in Spain. His name comes from where he was born, in Ghent. He tried to make a claim, so he spent a lot of time in Spain. He tried to make claim to the throne of Castile through his wife, Constance of Castile, who's, by the way, her father was known as Peter the Cruel, which are going to be a tyrant. That's a pretty good name to have. This theory came about in 1740 by a guy named Francis Peck, and he wrote it in Desiderata Curiosa. So these two characters, the wedding of Petronella, the celebration at that wedding at 1 year old, I'll point that out again, where the ceremony had a mock combat thing between the Moors and the Christians, so that's the first Morris dance, and then John of Gaunt supposedly brought it back to England in his travels. Take that for what you will. That has been a theory, that's a conventional theory that's been around for a while. Nobody knows, as I said. I will tell you some of the earliest, probably the earliest mention of Morris in England, and again, Morris being the adjective of this unusual dance, this unusual solemn ritual performance. The first mention that I know of was a will of a woman named Alice Wettenhale in 1458 in Bury St. Edmunds, and she wrote, "I leave my daughter Catherine's 3 silver cups sculpted with a Morris dance with one lid per item. So in other words, hey, it was important. Morris was well known enough that she didn't have to explain what Morris was in the will, and it was well known enough that it was part of the artistic foundation of this cup, of these cups. So you see, and again, Morris being an adjective, you see a bunch of derivations, flipping back, all these variations of the word Morris throughout continental Europe. Here's a dance from Croatia called the Moreska, and it is done to this very day, and it does feature Muslims versus the Christians, which is perhaps not the best thing for that particular area given their past strife. So Morris might have absorbed this type of dancing, and this type of dancing, this mock combat kind of dancing, has been known since, drumroll, the time of ancient Greece. And it's a whole class of dances called perikios. And for instance, Homer writes about a perikio, how Achilles danced the sword dance, danced this warrior dance around the burning funeral of Patroclus, which I never can pronounce properly. So, not saying that Morris is descended from these, from the hoary old past of ancient Greece, just saying that there is this undercurrent of ceremonial, perhaps combat dances that have existed in European culture for a long, long time. And it makes sense. If you're learning how to use a sword and practicing with a sword, it's a short step from sword practice and sword drills to a formalized sword dance where you're doing dance kind of moves or choreographed kind of moves. Here's a journal from, here's a page from Olaus Magnus, and he talks, he basically went around Europe and cataloged, hey, what the hell's going on in Europe in 1555. This particular page talks about a Swedish sword dance. And this is again from 1555. You have a pipe and tabor over to the left. You have 6 people coming in with swords in what looks suspiciously like a Morris set. You've got horn players off to the right, and you have something that looks like garland dancing going on. So something very familiar 500 years ago. And of course, you've probably heard of this gentleman. This was written in 1589. Mr. Arbot is the anagrammatic pen name of a French cleric named Jehan Tabarot. And I'm sorry, my pronunciation is terrible. He wrote this, as I say, in 1589. It's basically a series of annotations and comments about dancing. He writes particularly, well, one dance we're going to look at here is a buffon. And that is a Middle French word. It's from the Italian buffare, which means to puff out your cheeks in anger and, get ready for combat, and you're getting all geared up for combat. It's where we get the word buffoon, which I think is highly appropriate. All right, let's get out of this because this is cleverly, sorry. Boom, boom, boom. Lots of screens open. Here we go. So, sorry, this is Le Buffon from Arbot. This is a stylized sword dance, one of those perikios dances we're talking about. Look at how close and similar it is to, say, a modern Morris stick dance. Ba-da-dum. So that is a predecessor, one of the dance types that make up what we consider modern Morris dancing. Now, on top of Morris, on top of this traditional presentation dance phenomena that occurred, were overlaid figures and characters that kind of had a separate evolution, that had a similar evolution, a parallel evolution. One of them is a hobby horse. And if you look at a hobby horse, the origin of a hobby horse, well, I mean, it makes sense. It's the horse of a military character and very strong and powerful, but it's also, hey, this guy has enough money that he can take care of a horse, and he has, you know, the pasture or the barn or whatever one needs to take care of the horse. I also suspect, and this has absolutely no basis in fact other than a suspicion on my part, that if you owned a horse after the Black Death, after the great devastation where a third of Europe died, you could basically make your own, print your own money. Because if you owned a horse, you could plow a field for extra money, you could haul things for extra money, you had it made in the shade. And thankfully, horses, pigs, and sheep, the three animals that would have been around at that time, primarily in your English countryside, are pretty much resistant to plague. So I think a hobby horse is at least as old, if not older than Morris, and it became a part of Morris through what we'll talk about next, through the collection of fees, collection of alms and things like that. This type of horse, the Mary Lwyd horse, is a different origin, I believe. It is a much more mystical and much more folk play kind of horse than this type of horse, the horse and rider. Even though they're both quote unquote hobby horses, the horse and rider is much more of a statement of power, and this is much more a symbol of, say, an otherworldly approach. Horse and rider horses are prevalent throughout Europe. This is a horse from Poland. This is a glorious horse from Spain, where it's big enough that people actually get inside it and haul this massive wooden structure around the town. Another figure that comes into Morris is the Robin Hood character. And if you think about it, Robin Hood had to almost, it's just a function of being a human being. He's a common motif. He's the best of us, whether he's a nobleman who is wronged but still finds time to give back, or a lucky yeoman who's risen up and doesn't forget the poor. The whole of the Marvel Comics universe is based on the Robin Hood motif. And this character has, I would submit to you, it is a common human attribute. It's a common human belief that we all share as humans. And Robin Hood became associated with Morris through their mutual association of ales and alms, as did Marian, Maid Marian, who's wise and chaste and strong and a perfect mate for Robin Hood. Of course, Maid Marian, either as Maid Marian the noble or turned upside down as Maid Marian, a guy in drag, done for comic relief, is also a stock character. We see these stock characters throughout art, and we will see these all over the place in early Morris art. This is a series of carved figures from a guy named Erasmus Grasser. These were done in 1480 for a dance hall in Munich. And these were intended to be set on plinths. There are about 9 of them, I believe. And you used to be able to buy reproductions of these. I'm still looking for them. But so here's a couple of these figures. They're more like acrobats in a performing troupe than a true Morris figure. But you will see again that use of the word Morris Morris Contanzer, as a description, as an adjective as to what these guys are up to. This is a panel from Lancaster Castle. It's dated from the 1550s. It has that same kind of dancing figures. This, I think, is about 6 feet long. It's a carved wooden panel. Earlier than that is this copper plate from a guy named Israel van Meckenham, and it's from 1490. And you can see all our characters. Here's Maid Marian. Here is a pipe and tabor guy. Here's a fool. Here's dancers around her. And I do like the sleeping dog at her feet. The Bentley Window, which is originally in Bentley Hall, but this was created anywhere from 1509 to 1550. Mike Heaney suggested it was done by a Flemish artist done under commission. It has basically taken these figures and kind of made them a little less leggy and maybe flipped them and made them more artistic. And they fit on the panes of this window. This is now in the V&A Museum in London. Here's the Fool. Our standard Fool. Here's our hobby horse figure, horse and rider. I have no idea why there are two daggers piercing his cheeks, but do notice the ladle in the horse's mouth. That ladle becomes an instrument for collecting money, and you will see that instrument used over and over again. Here is an illustration from a Bible, from a page of the Psalms, and you see at the bottom left a pipe and tabor. To the bottom right is a fool. There's Maid Marian. There's Robin Hood, and for some reason in the middle of the page is a defecating monkey. I have no idea which particular psalm mentions a defecating monkey. I did not check that. This is a detail from a picture called the Thames at Richmond. It's in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. This was done about 1600s. And it's been attributed to a guy named David Vinkboons. And look at all the stuff going on here. It's a Morris dance, obviously in the middle. So you got three dancers. You've got them dancing with a Maid Marian character. You've got a horse and rider, a pipe and tabor. And look at the people. And this dance, I think this painting is talking about the universal appeal of Morris. So this carriage off in the background is obviously disgorged a husband, wife, and daughter, which are the characters at the very top. There's a passerby on another horse, just looking. Here's two people just out for a stroll, giving money, again, into that ladle to the fool. There's a guy at the far right, just a tradesman wandering. So it's the appeal of Morris. It's a universal appeal, the universal delight that people feel in Morris. It's a good, positive Morris picture, as it were. So, nope, let's see. Let's see kind of what that dance might have looked like. And this is probably the closest we're going to see. So quickly, this is 4 sets of 4. So just pay attention to the group closest to us. This is the lovely troupe Beltane Morris doing Brimfield, doing the Brimfield tradition. This might well have been what those linear Morris dances looked like. So we'll look at this for a few seconds. Yeah, talk amongst yourselves while I get this back here. Sorry, guys. Technical problems here. Phew, okay, that was drama. All right. One of the chief things that Morris accomplished was making money. Making money to support, say, the parish that the team was part of, or making money to support the poor. It wasn't until the Poor Laws of Elizabethan times and again in 1834 that there was any kind of relief for the poor. It was expected that poor relief would fall to the parish. And one of the ways the parish did it was to hold ales. And ale has meant, you'll be happy to know, the same thing since Proto-Germanic times. It has meant ale, but it has a connotation of magic, intoxication, and celebration. You'll be happy to know the word bride has meant the same thing since Proto-Germanic times. So bridal party and so forth is a bride ale, is a bridal celebration. This we're looking at, by the way, Caldwell Ale House in Caldwell, or Herefordshire. This was built in 1530. It is basically the church basement of the church, of the parish. It was a place where if it was not good weather, or if for some other reason, they would use this hall as the hire hall for having an ale, having a celebration to raise money. These celebrations were held as often as needed. They were generally held at festivals or at important times, like a lamb ale was held at lambing time, etc. But again, they could be held as often as possible, as needed. In 1497, the parish of Bassingbourn and Cambridge held no less than 10 of these things. So here is a discussion of all the things that went into putting one of those ales. This is from 1505. You have a load of wood. You have the felling and hauling of the same wood. You have minstrels coming. You have 4 bushels of wheat and a peck to make, I assume, alcohol out of. You've got 2 sheep. You've got a quarter of a mutton. You have spices. Towards the middle, you were paid to Hugh Price for making clean the ale house. So it was a celebration, but it was intended to raise money for parish needs. One of the most common ways that occurred too, of course, was the maypole, which was a way for everybody to get involved in the celebrations. Here is an illustration from Michael Drayton's Polyolbion. It was basically a topographical poem published between 1612 and 1622. Hi Ho for the Cotswolds. Here's a tune called The Jovial Maypole Dancers from 1695, written by Jonah Deacon, to the Top and Top Gallant tune. And it's all about dancing around maypoles. Here's a nice painting of them from 1750, country dancers. So it really permeated and you can see the church in the background, it really permeated the atmosphere of English celebration. Part and parcel to these kind of country celebrations, these parish-based celebrations were courtly celebrations. And these were earlier even, or contemporary to the Morris that we think of, the rural and the ales. So for instance, the Inns of Court, basically the Bar Association of England, Gray's Inn, Lincoln's Inn, the Inner Temple and Middle Temple, you weren't anything if you didn't know how to dance. So in addition to knowing the law, you had to have some form of dance capability. So let's see if we can swing this one more time. This will be our last video. And sorry, I keep doing this. What we're looking at is, again, in our bow tune, it's called a galliard, but this is what these things probably look like. You would have couples, man and woman or man and man, whatever. You would have couples come out, perform a dance. They would make way for the next couple. They would make way for the next couple. Then the 4 sets of couples would interact. So let's go through a couple of these. Where on earth are we at this point? Okay. So here is from a man named Andre Favin, the Theater of Honor, where he talks about the feast. He talks about the celebratory feast of a guy who got appointed to the Order of the Garter. The 5th service, and this is what was the banquet. The 5th service was of pies, tarts, dishes of cream, orangeados, and citrons confected, each table being likewise served with 140 silver dishes. After this said service was carried another entire course, which was a great hill or mountain borne by 24 men. In the mountain stood 2 fair artificial fountains. From the one flowed abundantly rose water, and from the other musk water, God knows what, yielding an admirable smell over all the hall. From diverse quarters and parts of the mountain issued forth 4 young live conies and sundry types of small birds. In a hollow places of said hill stood 4 young lads and a damsel, attired like savages, who came forth at a passage in the rock, dancing by good direction an excellent morisco before the assembly. So, how's that? Holy smokes. That was quite the celebration, but you can see that the Morris also was part of courtly life, and you were expected really to be able to dance if you were in the court at all. So by 1572, there was a decided backlash by the Puritans against Morris, and it is mentioned in several rather strong pamphlets and things that were written. So it was declared, the May games and ales and so forth were declared papish and immoral. Here's John Northbrook, priest, in 1582, arguing about what things are repugnant in Christian society, and he damned Morris dancing, and dancing in particular, as wicked and filthy. Christopher Featherstone, a dialogue against light, lewd, and lascivious dancing. Let me read you this. If you do think that I will better like of your May games than I do of your other common dancings which you do commonly use, you are much mistaken, for I am, skipping ahead, for I am so far from liking well-loved that I like better of your common practices with the liking which I have thereof, but a little. For the abuses which are committed in your May games are infinite. The first is abuse, the first whereof is that you do use to attire men and women's apparel, whom you most commonly call May Marians, whereby you infringe that strait commandment which is given in Deuteronomy 22:5, that men must not put on women's apparel for fear of, and get ready for this, fear of enormities. The second abuse, which of all others is the greatest, is this, that it hath been that your Morris dancers have danced naked in nets. In other words, danced naked in fields. And I could not for the life of me figure out what the hell he was talking about, but we'll come to that in a second. What greater enticement unto naughtiness could have been devised? The third abuse is that you, because you will know something, do commonly run into the woods at nighttime amongst maidens, and inasmuch as I have heard of 10 maidens go into the woods basically at May, and 9 of them come out with child. Good heavens. Here's what I think he was talking about, naked in the woods. This is a bizarre Florentine print from the 1470s. It's a Morris dance where there are 9 naked guys dancing around one naked woman in a field. I believe this is what Mr. Featherston was talking about. Philip Stubbs here writes, basically, I'm just upset with people having a good time. The most famous Morris dancer from history is a guy named William Kemp. He was a comedian. He was part of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, which you probably know was the Shakespeare's own troupe, or the troupe that primarily performed Shakespeare's plays. He was probably the first Falstaff, for instance. He was important enough in the company that he was named as one of the principals until he got into a fight, being a temperamental actor at all, with the other Lord Chamberlain's men. He got kicked out. He tried to keep himself in the public eye. This is one of his great schemes, and of course we know about him to this day, Kemp's 9 Days Wonder. He had this printed. He danced from London to Norwich, about probably 100 miles, over a period of 9 days spread over several weeks, where he spent it in various bars and restaurants and with maidens and so forth. Here's the text of it. You please have a read of this. It makes quite an interesting thing. It's on the internet, as are most of these texts that I'm talking about. This is my particular favorite. This is Old Mag of Herefordshire. It's written in 1609. I thought for a long time it was written by William Kemp. It was not. Kemp died in 1603. This was written in 1609. It was sold at a shop near the great south doors of St. Paul's Cathedral. And it describes, and this is why I mentioned this to you, it describes a Morris dance. Basically, it's drumming up business for a Morris presentation. But to tell you why I like it in particular, to thee, O hall, for thy age and art, mightest have cured an ox that was eaten at the feast of St. Quintin's, that for thy warlike music mightest have struck up at Bullen. Hey, that's my ancestral castle. What can I tell you? My people have been involved in Morris for 1 billion years. So we're getting to the end of this, guys. So take a deep breath. So what happened? By the time the 1800s rolled around, we went from the court and being the worst thing in the world and these great revolts and these great sins and so forth to being almost a joke. Here is a play from 1844. You can see very kind of highlighted there that the Morris dance becomes really just kind of this sideshow silliness, like kind of a parody of what the Village Green bumpkins are. So what happened? How did we go from the courts and being so important that priests had to rail against it to being a joke, basically, and dying off? Well, a lot of things. of course, and you'll use the analogy of the dark satanic mills, the Industrial Revolution happened, of course, and lo and behold, all the population came to work in the mills, and a lot of people left their dead-end lives and nowhere to come live in scary industrial towns. The Poor Laws, as I mentioned, in 1834, very well-meaning and did a lot of good, but it also took one of the legs out of, took a major leg out of one of the reasons that you went and had processions and had games and things like that. They weren't needed anymore. More insidious was the Waltham Black Act of 1723. It was drafted to deal with a minor agrarian uprising near Waltham Chase in Hampshire, in which a group of laborers had burned haystacks and poached fish and game, and they had disguised themselves and so forth. But it made it at least a transportable offense, if not a hanging offense, to appear in disguise. And in theory, one could be literally hanged for appearing on the high street with a sooty or otherwise blackened face. So that really put a damper on things that required ritual disguise. Another factor to the downfall, quote unquote, of Morris of this time was the rise of violins. Now I'm going to expand this out a little bit. You can see, but look at all the pipe and tabor groups. These are, or pipe and tabor musicians. These are the pipe and tabor musicians that played for Morris teams. And this is a work done by John Forrest. And when the fiddle came in, a lot of Morris dancers basically, and I'm not kidding you, could not dance to the fiddle. They did not understand it, and they did not, were not able to keep up with, there was no beat. The tabor was gone. And finally, of course, the mass, huge armies of the Napoleonic era. These took you, you can imagine these were either conscripted or you joined the army, but you went off and fought in Europe or fought in Egypt or fought in Russia or wherever you ended up. And lo and behold, that certainly broke up the, you either wounded or you'd gone off to another town or whatever, but it certainly broke up the harmony of these traditional festivals. I point this out to look at the kit here, to look at their uniforms. You'll notice the baldricks, and the baldricks came about because of that invention of the socket bayonet, like the guy on the right-hand side is carrying on his musket. And on one side of that baldric is the sheath for your socket, for your bayonet, and on the other side is your cartridge case. And we know this, the baldricks that you wear on your Morris kit come from this military paraphernalia. Kit is a Middle Dutch word. It meant originally a jug or a tankard. By 1780, the word had taken on the connotation of collecting possession for marching off to war. Our kind of Cotswoldy Morris comes from this time. Frankly, it has origins of this time. The Tune Brighton Camp, for instance, refers to a military camp. Here's a close-up of a painting called the Dixon Harvesters. Look at their outfits. They have their baldricks on. They have their tricorn hat on. These guys, if you gave them a musket, would not look out of place at all in a military. Here is Cecil Sharp's demonstration team. This is from 1912. I'm sorry, this is from 1910. From right to left, to give you an idea of the effect of war, the effect that warfare has had on Morris throughout the centuries, in addition to Kit. From right to left, Wilkerson was killed in the Battle of the Somme. Claude Wright, who's the second from right, was still engaged as the time of this photo as a squadron leader in Egypt. Third is Mr. Lucas. He was killed in the Battle of the Somme. George Butterworth, who's 2 over, was killed in the Battle of the Somme. Douglas Kennedy was the only one, number 6, who resumed his folk dancing efforts, but his son in turn was killed in the Second World War. Here's a photograph of the Abbots Bromley horn dancers in 1915. You'll notice the guys in the back row, the people involved in the dance are all in military uniform. They're about to ship off with the Lincoln Regiment. 2 of those guys died. Arthur died at the Battle of Loos, and David died at the Battle of Arras. And the guy on the far left in the uniform was wounded so badly he could no longer dance the Morris. Cecil Sharp House in London. Here it is being hit by a stray bomb. Here's a thing from the English Folk Dance and Song Society in 1943. A guy was captured and was in a prison camp, and to keep from going crazy in solitary confinement, he would dance country dances all day. He would dance all 16 positions of it. And finally, in 1945, pieces come to Europe, and we are once again able to meet in a free spirit of thankfulness and joy in a battle-scarred Cecil Sharp House. The English Folk Dance and Song Society did a lot during the war in keeping the folk traditions of conquered nations, Poland and so forth, keeping the folk traditions alive, or giving people a place to dance those from the refugees from those countries. And finally, and this is a segue into what I hope will have to be a quick English Abbots Bromley horn dance discussion. Here's a photograph of the Abbots Bromley horn dance from 1944. Let me turn to let me turn and see how we're doing. If nobody's chewed off their leg to get out of listening to this, we'll go on to the Abbots Bromley horn dance, and we'll go from there. Any questions that I need to answer? All right, keep going, Andy. Okay. All right, here we go, guys. Bum ba da dum. Stop. All right. We're gonna whip through Abbots Bromley, yay. All right, here's Abbots Bromley. It is a town that was founded, this will be your trivial pursuit. You're supposed to learn one new thing a day. Here it is. The town was probably, there was a spot in the woods, basically called Bromley, which was where there was a bunch of broom corn. In 946, a guy named Wulfric the Black was granted the territory and response from as a reward for his service against the Vikings. His grandson, named Wulfric Spot, I kid you not, he was the Earl of Mercia. If you remember back to that first slide, was a very religious guy. He founded a Benedictine order at Burton-on-Trent in 1004 and endowed it with 72 manors, one of which was Abbots Bromley. In other words, the town of Bromley, the town in this Bromley, which was in charge of providing upkeep to the abbey. Wulfric was a man of deep religious conviction, and he was chief counselor to King Ethelred the Unready, like his mother, Wulfrun, who established the Wolverhampton Monastery in 994. Abbots Bromley became an important town in its day because of its central location. It's located between a bunch of towns. Most importantly, and this is the most important part to our story, it was granted the right to have a 3-day-long fair by King Henry III. And that was in basically, I think, 1339. Relations between the abbey and the town were often strained. The monks were often arrogant and lawless. There are accounts of them stealing fish and cows, assaulting people. sexually harassing people. In one instance, they stole 100 shillings, which is a lot of money, from a woman. The lands of the abbey were redistributed after the dissolution of the monastery by King Henry VIII, of course, and the village of Abbots Bromley was given to a guy named Sir William Paget, clerk of the signet and Henry's privy councillor. Sir William, a staunch Catholic, objected to, of course, Henry's marriage to, creation of the Church of England. He was placed in the Tower in 1551, fined £3,000. His land and properties were seized and put at disposal of the king. He was restored to power, but the family was forced out of its own titles because of poverty and bad debts by the 1800s, and their ancestral home, which we'll look at briefly, became divided up. Basically, six different families lived there, including the descendants to this day of those people. Here is 942 King Edmund granting 40 hides, in other words, 120 acres, 40 times 120 acres, to Wulfric the Black, one of them being the town that eventually became Abbots Bromley. This is, you'll remember the discussion of the almshouse. Here's the almshouse of Abbots Bromley, which is quite a grand affair. We're looking at St. Nicholas Church, which we will talk about in a bit. This is what was the village hall. It's now the Goat's Head Inn. Here's a photograph from, I think, 1932. It's a postcard, actually, of the horn dance being done in front of the village hall. Next to the village hall and featuring prominently in our story, dear friends, is the market cross. And this was kind of the center of the market that went on for 3 days, etc., from the time of Henry III. The Goat's Head Inn in the back. Here's a lovely woodcut of it from the 1800s. And there's St. Nicholas off to the left, Goat's Head Inn, which at the time would have been the village hall, and of course the market cross. In 1686, a guy named, Dr. Robert Plott wrote the Natural History of Staffordshire. He also wrote the Natural History of Oxfordshire. He writes, at Abbotsford, now rather Pageants Bromley. Remember, it was named Pageants Bromley after the abbey was dissolved. They had also within memory a sort of sport which they celebrated at Christmas or New Year, on New Year's and 12th day, called a hobby horse dance, where from a person that carried the image of a horse between his legs made of thin boards, and in his hand a bow and arrow, which passing through a hole in the bow and stopping upon a shoulder, it had in it made a snapping noise. Da, 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 da. Keeping time with the music, with this man danced 6 others, carrying on their shoulders as many reindeers' heads, 3 of them painted white, 3 red, with the arms of the chief families, Pageant, Badgett, Wells, to whom the revenues of the town chiefly belonged, depicted on the palms of them. To this hobby horse dance, there also belonged a pot. Remember our pot, remember that gourd thing that was used to collect money, which was kept by turns, and they still have that, by the way, which was kept by turns by 4 or 5, the chief of the town, whom they called the Reeves, which provided cakes and ales to put in this pot. All people who had any kindness for the good intention of the institution of the sport, giving a pence for peace for themselves and families, and so foreigners too, and came to see it. With which money, the charge of the cakes and ales being defrayed, they not only repaired their church, but kept their poor too. Again, remember the poor laws, which charges are now not perhaps so cheerfully borne. Okay, same edition of that 1686, the 1686 page, 484, I think it was, 434. That same edition was kept handed down. So a guy named Sir Simon Dagg wrote in 1700, this custom was continued till the war. And I have seen it off practice. They had something of this kind likewise for getting money for repairs for the church at Stafford. And James Broughton, same edition, same book, I mean, in 1841, a party of men from Abbots Bromley still go about the country, do races, and grotesquely attired with deer's horns on their heads, and one of them arrayed as a hobby horse. They distribute papers containing ye above passage from plot descriptive of ye dance. There you go. Here's a diary letter, which I won't read particularly because we're running out of time, but basically this is from 1700. This guy is named Richard Wilkes. He's in town, and this is quite romantic. He's in town to court a young woman whose name I can't remember. It doesn't matter. But Mr. Wilkes is there, and he writes as he sits in that market at that market cross. He writes about the horn dance in 1700. All right. Here's a photograph from 1905. This is this is a Sir Benjamin Stone, who was particularly fascinated, Victorian photographer, Edwardian photographer. And this is the team in front of the market cross. Hey guys, if you have money, Goat's Head Inn, I found this out, is for sale, or at least to let. So if you want to own a bit of Abbots Bromley history, there you go. Side note, St. Mary's, St. Anne's is a school there, and it's kind of cool. They have a procession. Here's a photo. So graduation day, 1922. Here's a photo. But here's a photo from a couple of years ago. So they're still doing this procession through the town, looking the tiniest bit like Handmaid's Tale, but hey. Okay. So here's Pageants, Bromley. Here's a map from 1600 of Staffordshire. And you can see, I detailed this bit. It's now called Pageants, Bromley. That's kind of cool. This is a church of St. Nicholas, and it is has gone through a lot of changes. Basically, okay, so the English Civil War was particularly hard on Abbots Bromley. It's between two garrisons, opposing garrisons. Stafford had basically the Royalists, Litchfield had the Roundheads, and it was kind of caught in between. The church was in very sorry shape. So Robert Plott writes about the dance in 1686. He writes that it used to go on, that the dance had stopped, and the reason dance had stopped is probably because of the English Civil War and the chaos caused by that. By 1700 or so, this church, St. Nicholas, was in bad shape. And so probably the dance was started again, 1700, 1710, after that cessation in the 1640s, to raise money to rebuild the church, which they did in this kind of high Gothic style. The area that is closest to us is called Hurst Chapel. It becomes important because that is where the horns are kept. Here's a list of all the priests up till 1979, when I collected this, or it doesn't matter. This is a list of all the priests up from the beginning of 1086. So they have a good list of the people that have been the people in charge of that. This is St. Nicholas inside, and you're looking at my photos from 1992. This is a view up towards the altar, obviously. As you get up to the altar, if you look to your left, there's Hurst Chapel, and lo and behold, the horns are kept on brackets in the wall. This is a close-up of the horns on the brackets. You will notice between the middle black horns and the middle white horns is the hoop of the hobby horse, which is kept up there. So there's the horns. Here's a detail of the wood. The wood has been successfully dated to, I believe come on, Andy, believed to the 1500s. The horns themselves, the largest of the horns, the heaviest pair, the great horns are called, weigh 25 1/4 pounds. and are 39 inches at their greatest span. The lightest pair, which is still pretty darn heavy, weighs in at 16¼ pounds and is 35 inches wide. These horns were carbon dated to 1085 plus or minus 85 years. So probably what happened was they were captured as war booty from the Vikings. These are of the species Rongifer ferrandus ferrandus, or Tarandus tarandus, which are the domesticated reindeer, lo and behold. They were captured. These wooden heads were created for them. I believe, and this theory is from okay, C.S. Byrne writes that she mentioned that the Abbots Bromley men in 1125 were given grazing rights to the surrounding Needwood forest for an annual rent of 10 shillings. So that meant the villagers had extra forage for their domestic animals, fuel in the winter, fruits, small game, occasional injured or wounded deer. Without this right of access, any villager caught in the forest would be accused of poaching, etc., etc. So it is my belief, as is C.S. Byrne, that the horns were taken out as basically a reminder to the powers that be that we have rights to the royal forest around us. And these horns are taken all over the parish, kind of beating the grounds of the parish. This is where our rights are. So in addition to raising money for the parish, in addition to raising money for the poor in the parish, the horns also have a function of, hey, we're here, we've got rights to this place, by God, we're just reminding you of it. It's photographed from 1900, same obviously. So the day of, it starts early in the morning, the team comes out, the horns get taken off their mountings, and they're blessed by the priest, the whole thing. Off they go. Traditionally, and Sharp mentions this, traditionally they go in a line. Of late, within the past 40, 50 years, they've gone in double, simpler double procession. So this is a very poor photo on my part. I'm sorry. This is from 1992. Here's a cop leading them down the street. Here is the line, the procession. They've got a whole bunch of people coming with them as they go from place to place. Here is the same team, 1992, with the Bobby, but they've gone to the double. The double procession is a little easier for them because they don't have to do all kinds of winding and unwinding to get into the proper dance set. So and here, I love it. The dance is not, we tend to make it in the US, we tend to make it very woo-woo, very, very mystical and so forth. It is not, it is a celebration. So here is the Bobby. He's taken up the horns and is doing one stand with the dancers. Here's somebody's mom taking up the horns and doing a stand with the dancers, probably this kid's. I love this photo. They're tramping, this is from the 30s, they're tramping through the bounds of the whole place. And I can see this teenager saying, okay, I'll do your damn dance, but I'm not gonna carry the horns when nobody can see me. So it's not continual dancing. They dance, they process, they stop, they have snacks, they drink a lot, and I do mean a lot, at various spots. And carrying those damn horns around, they're heavy. They put them down, and it's an effort to lift the things up after 6 hours carrying them around all over rural Staffordshire. They go to this place, Blissfield Hall. Now this is the ancestral home that I was talking about, which has now been divided up into 6 places. And in the height, this made me feel about as English as you could possibly feel. So here we are in the audience. There's a moat. They go to the T assembled on the lawn, where we commoners have to watch across the moat as they perform for the Pageants family. Okay, so if they're doing that one long line. Here's how they assemble into a circle. They've assembled into a set. I'm sorry, this is how they assemble into a set. They form up a set. Here's a circling. Here's this in photographic evidence. Here they're circling. They have basically, and think about carrying those heavy horns and fragile horns. They date, they're 1,000 years old, basically. You're carrying these things. So your figures aren't going to be too fancy. So there's an advance, meet, and retire. And there's a crossover. So here's the advance, meet, and retire. Basically, it's a come up, pause, and go back. Same figure. And then they cross over, go to the next line, do an advance, retire, cross over, and go back to where they were. You can see this guy in the middle. The horns are so big to try and cross them, they have to kind of duck to get them under each other. And when they're done at that place, off they go. And either this is how they get out of there if they want to do a single line, or if they're in that double procession, they just go. And the town of Abbots Bromley takes advantage of this quite a bit. So Horn Dance Day becomes the puppet museum and the art exhibit and the local hospice and the fruit, produce, vegetable, flower gardening and walks in the town and all kinds of stuff. It's important enough to tourism, of course, that it appears on their brochures. The costumes I want to talk briefly about. There was no costume up until 1887. In 1887, the Reverend J.M. Lowe decided to have a costume. It was pretty formal and pretty elaborate. It was in honor of the Queen's Jubilee. Unfortunately, that costume, the 1887, they kind of ruined. As Marcia Rice describes in delicate words, nights supposed to be spent in other village inns, were sometimes, after too great hospitality, spent lying out in the open. This next costume is the 1904 Berkeley costume, which lasted a pretty long time. That's what it looks like. I love the musician. This is a stock photo, obviously, but I love the musician with the tassel off the melodeon. Another view of the costume here. Like I said, this was the costume from, this is them going off to war in 1915. 1945, they still have the Berkeley costume from 1904. Parts of it are starting to fall apart in 1981. The trousers are there, but the tunic's different. By 1992, different everything with the exception, and sorry I don't have a photo of it. There's one kid that still has that 1904 costume, but these have obviously been remade. And here is the modern costume. Talk briefly about the music. You mostly know this tune. This is the Wheelwright Robinson tune. Let me see what pompous things I say about this. Okay. This is probably the most well-known tune. It is probably an air that comes from sometime around the Civil War, and it probably started life as, frankly, as an exercise. The man who contributed this was a guy named Robinson. He was the wheelwright in the town. He was a very good fiddle player, and he remembered this tune, quote unquote, well. He never played for the dance, but he was born in the 1790s. He indicated the tune was ancient in his day, and I think it was around 1700, and I think the basis of this thing was a fiddle exercise, because it's hard to play in second and fourth position, and I think it started life as a finger exercise. Anyway, my theory on that tune, but there are all kinds of tunes associated with it. It is a upbeat dance. There's Yankee Doodle. There's these tunes from that other people remembered. Lily Marlene. We heard the Mickey Mouse theme, Cock of the North. Bobby Shafto. There was this music hall tune, and her golden hair was hanging down her back. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a rap. and I bless you for staying with me for this whole time. Wow, that was quite a lot of Andy and quite a lot of history. I hope you enjoyed it.
Right. Andy, before everyone else uncloaks, I am going to hit stop on YouTube.